Welcome to the Freight Directory podcast, covering all things related to freight, logistics, and supply chain, both in Australia and internationally.
Welcome to the Freight Directory podcast. I'm Christine Contos, and this is another episode of Freight Directory. Today, our guest is Andrew Hudson. Andrew is a lawyer in customs and trade and international trade law and relations, and he is a partner for Rigby Cooke Lawyers. Welcome, Andrew, and thanks for coming along.
Thank you, Christine. Good evening.
It's really nice to see you.
Yeah, nice to see you too.
Andrew, you're pretty well known in the industry. You're a legend in the industry, really, and you do so much for the industry. And there's quite a good story behind all that. Tell me about Andrew growing up and some of the family dynamics.
Sure, absolutely. Well, very recently, doing the whole My Heritage thing, we did discover that there was an ancestor who was the collector of government revenues in Guernsey, one of the English Channel ports. That's going back a long way, so that connection's fairly thin. More immediately, my father.
That's actually freaky.
It is freaky, and I'm trying to have it expunged from the record. But from more recently, more immediately, my father, he was a customs officer for many years. So he joined customs. He was born in 1934, so he joined in 1954. He was 20 years old.
Wow.
He didn't have most of his male, if you like, senior or father figures were older men who'd been to war and Second World War and had come back and were fairly damaged by it. But most of them worked, but a lot of them worked at customs, as it turned out. And it was very much the Irish Catholic mafia at customs in those days. So
that's hilarious.
Well, it was. Well, there were the O'Connors and the like, and there have been for many, many years.
Tough crew.
Well, very tough crew. The police had the Masons, but the tough crew, and they were mainly, as I said, they were mainly gentlemen who'd been to war and didn't have any treatment for it. So their idea of treatment was to knock off at 7 a.m. and go to the watersiders for a beer. Now, they were
that's where you did business.
Well, in many respects. And that's why that was a lot of his influence. And I think even though he did brilliantly at school and was offered scholarships to university, he got a maths scholarship, which he didn't take up, and a law scholarship. I think he fell into what was immediately relevant to him. He was associated with a lot of people who were associated with customs. And in those days, for a young Catholic man looking to start a career, it was one of the more immediate relevant options.
Yeah.
And he joined alongside a lot of his mates from South Melbourne, where he grew up. And so he joined in 1954. So over the years, he went through the various iterations. So when he first started, he would do things like go and meet the passenger vessels at the heads, out, in the bay. And in those days, they had immigrants on.
Was that Port Melbourne? Yeah.
Well, even further out to the heads, where the ocean meets the bay.
Right.
And he would go up the side of the ship, and he'd have to go through the manifest and see everybody and check off that they are in fact the person on the passport and the person for whom approval had been given.
Oh, wow.
And he'd do it with a more senior officer. And that was part of his, but getting up the gangplank or getting up the side of his ship out at the heads was quite difficult. And a lot of the international liners used to take pride in looking after the customs officers. They wanted to make sure everything went through okay. There was no smuggling or the like. And so regularly at 2 and 3 in the morning, he'd be offered a pink gin just to make sure that the whole thing went through smoothly. And that was how the world used to work.
Yeah, wow, that's pretty interesting. Yeah, because it would be very rough out at those heads and.
Yeah, it was. And then then he worked at the wharves, and he was in charge of 13 Wharf, which is no longer a wharf anymore because we don't have wharves as such anymore.
Yeah.
And then he worked through various roles within what was then the Australian Customs Service, including time in Canberra at different times on different training things. Because he was bright, he was particularly good at investigation and cross-examination. And for a number of years, they offered him overseas postings.
So
customs.
you would have had a lot of great stories growing up, and of course
Oh yeah,
now there's an overseas posting.
yeah.
So
So in 72, I think he was offered New York, and that was too far away. 73, he was offered Japan, and because of his history with his father and what happened to his father, he wasn't keen on Japan. And 74, 73, he was offered London, but it was the middle of the general strike in the UK at that time. So you only had power until 8 o'clock. You only had, shops were only open on certain days, and he didn't want to take his young family with him because there were five of us by then. I was the eldest of five. And in 74, he finally relented and agreed to a posting in the London office of customs. Now, there's obviously people know about Australia House in the Strand in London, but down from the Strand there's a side street called Maltravers Street, and there was
oh, wow.
a building called Canberra House, which is very close to the Strand and very close to the Underground.
Right.
And in Canberra House, the Australian Customs Service had an office for a number of years. They then closed it in the late 70s, but they reopened it in Brussels, and now they're back in London again. So from 74 to 77, he basically we had to obviously move with him. So there's five children, his mother-in-law and his wife and him. So there's eight of us in the English.
Yeah. How old are you at this stage?
I was 11. So, but I had to be a responsible 11.
Yeah.
As it turned out, I was the eldest of the others, and not that they paid any attention to what I said, but I could at least pretend. So we went to, so we lived in a place called Godalming, which is outside Guildford, which is the county town of Surrey, 45 minutes away by British Rail to London. And I went to school in Guildford in the next main city. And Dad worked out of the London office, but he was only there probably 2 weeks in 3, because 1 week in 3 he'd go to Europe to do an investigation. The reason they had an office in London was to keep an eye on the European and British companies. So 1 week in 3 he'd be away somewhere in Europe before the EU, before all these things. So he would, what would happen once, there'd be a knock on the front door of this big house we had in Surrey, 7 o'clock or 6 o'clock even, there'd be a driver from the Australian Embassy or the Australian High Commission, and he'd be driven to Heathrow, put on an internal flight to Sweden or Germany or France or Norway or Finland, or on occasion Israel, wherever it happened to be. So those days it was all first class all the way for public service. So he would have 1 week in 3. He would literally be overseas, and so my mother and my grandmother had to run the house and look after 5 children on their own. But there were compensations. There was one night, Dad rang us. It was his second trip overseas. He was in Sweden. He was in Stockholm, and he rang and he said, this is in 1974, remember? He said, I've just been down in the bar and I've heard this really good group. And we all rolled our eyes and thought that Dad knows. And it was ABBA. So he'd been to see ABBA in a pub in Stockholm.
Before they were actually famous, before they became really big.
Starting to get famous. So
how incredible, yeah.
And there are other stories like that. There's a host of them.
So were you exposed to his customs stories from a young
absolutely.
age?
Yeah, as you know, he wouldn't tell me. I was 11 and 12, so there was cricket probably came first, but then and maybe current affairs and politics. But we did talk about. So I got to see from his perspective, and what I realised very very quickly was that Australia was a relatively small part of the whole world. Even though we were big inside.
Long way away. Yeah.
Long way away. Didn't have a big influence on the rest of the world. And there was a whole lot of things affecting the world of trade and the world of politics and commerce. And we were sort of at the tail end of that. And therefore, there was a much bigger world and much more, in many respects, a much more interesting world. So in those days, Australia was still fairly insular and fairly self-absorbed. We'd had the heavy migration, but the idea with the migration was that they would come in and they would assimilate. So there wasn't a lot of breadth of experience. So we had...
So we weren't looking outward. We weren't looking outward, were we? We still had huge tariffs.
Yes, and we wanted massive...
Very protectionist.
And it wasn't until Hawke and Keane came along with the tariff, or the Button plan, John Button, the then the industry minister who initiated the plan to reduce tariffs, and that was much later.
Yeah, that's
So,
right.
and customs officer is, it's part a military thing, it's part a paramilitary thing, it's part a police role, it's part of an investigative role.
Yes.
And in those days, no faxes, no emails, phone calls were rare, no mobiles.
Yeah.
A lot of it they got through confidential telexes and confidential ciphers which had to then be converted when they came into the London office. So that was 3 years of that, and I went to school, obviously, because 3 years out of school would have been difficult. Went to a secondary school, which was scary enough because not only were there English people, there were also girls at school, and that was something I wasn't used to. And we sort of went through that, and we had the 3 years overseas, and then not long after a little bit after the Fraser government came back, they decided to truncate periods of time, and so we came back in 1977. So I came back thinking I hadn't changed, but apparently my voice had, and my teachers all called me England for a long time, which is very distressed.
That is hilarious. So you've done your family tree. There's some link to it on your mother's side of the family, I hear, and then your dad's a customs officer.
Correct.
Quite senior to be travelling and doing what he's
absolutely.
doing.
Yeah.
And at any stage, did you think, oh yeah, that's really interesting. I think I'd like to build a career in that respect?
Well, I was exposed to it, and I think even at that stage, I wanted to be a lawyer. Now, I'm one of these people who aren't like a lot of people who say, I don't know what I want to do. I had always wanted to be either a centre-half forward for the Melbourne Football Club, and that's my talent. I wanted to open the batting for Australia, and there was some chance of that, but injuries got me. But I always wanted to be a lawyer. And
so you knew that at the age of 11?
I can never remember not wanting to be a lawyer.
Wow.
So now, whether it was my father twisting my mind, because at different times at one stage he did start up a career or started up to Melbourne Uni Law School, but it was the same time that they hung the last person in Australia, Ronald Ryan.
Oh yeah.
He was very. He said he was very dissuaded by that. He was very thought it was political and horrible, so he stopped going to law school. Now, whether that's in fact the case or not, I don't know. But he always thought so. He had sort of careers picked out for a lot of us, but in particular for an oldest child who seemed to have some skills in humanities that seemed to fit me better. I was never going to be anything to do with science or maths, no skills there whatsoever.
Really?
But parents in those days often, sowed ideas in your head.
Yes, they did, because we didn't. Yeah, you didn't get them off the internet or Instagram.
Oh no, and they just wanted you, so they sort of push and pull you. So things like, I am told that I was able to read the newspaper before I went to prep.
Well, that's impressive.
Well, it's slightly tragic too. But I was told that just before, when I was very young, we had the situation you might recall with Harold Holt, who was our Prime Minister, who disappeared off Portsea, and John Gorton became the leader. Now, he was in the Senate at the time, and the convention is that the leader should be in the lower house, in the House of Representatives. Yeah. And so the idea was he would become effectively our local member at Higgins. Now, apparently, and there is ABC TV video of this, of me at the polling station with my parents at about the age of 4, with John Gorton, and John Gorton said to me, "What are you doing here? Do you know what's going on, young man?" And apparently I said, "Oh, we're here so you can become the real Prime Minister." Now,
at 4, that's
which is a bit. So the humanities, the ability to read, and start, and
from a very young age.
Well, I'd read most of the books apparently in the children's library at the local library, and then I was allowed to go into the adult side. So it was a bit voracious. So secondary school.
I think that's very clever if that's what your parents do. That's really, really clever.
Well, they sort of nudged me that way. I mean, they had, Dad hadn't finished university. My mother had finished year 11 at University High, which is a selective school in Melbourne. She got straight A's, but her father, who was an older man of a particular generation, said, well, you've got 5 A's, that's great, but you don't need a Year 12 education, you're a woman.
Yeah. That was the
And
times.
she went to work for Imperial Tobacco, where she actually met Dad, because Dad came in to do an audit of Imperial Tobacco, and he was 20 and very much a man of the world, but a bit old, and she was 16. And he met her there, and he was the man around town. And one thing led to another, and she was married at 20, he was married at 24, and it all went
Yeah.
downhill from there.
The rest is history. I don't know.
History.
Now, now,
But I did see, I would often go down to the docks with Dad. I would often go to the wharves. I would go to the airports. He was in charge of border places. So he was in charge of the ports, the airports,
familiar
even the
territory
ports.
then, huh? Yeah.
So, and I would often go along with him. And
Yeah.
on regular occasions, I'd go into town and I'd meet Dad at one of the old customers' houses, whether in Flinders Street or William Street. And I knew all his mates. They were all effectively family anyway. So I got used to being around them, and I found the whole thing terribly interesting. And I think I've
Yeah.
said it previously, the practice of what I do is a sort of combination of, there's a whole chunk of law, there's a large chunk of politics, and economics as well. And when I'm lucky, there's some languages, so I can drag the French out again. So all of that. So what happened?
Yeah, well, it's fascinating. It's fascinating. It's an amazing story. Thank you for sharing that with us.
That's fine.
So you're not only a lawyer in customs and trade and international trade law and relations, right? You do a lot more. But you're also a director for the Australian Export Council,
yes,
IFCBA Advisory Committee, and a life member, an executive committee member of Food and Beverage Importers Committee. But you also hold other positions. Talk to me about that. Tell us more about all that.
Yeah. So what happened was, you become a young lawyer, you get articles, you go, and we then had articles, which is where you basically were a slave for 12 months.
Yeah.
So I went down a particular pathway where they pushed me down, and I got to be a partner doing mergers and acquisitions and corporate stuff, and I didn't really like it that much. And so I said, okay, I want to do this. And they said, that's fine, but you've got to do it on your own time. So I had to find out a way of cracking myself into the industry. And the best way is to build relationships through associations and through. So I joined a law council committee on customs and international transactions. I got to know people, lawyers and members of the industry, customs brokers and freight forwarders and so forth. And that was through the law council. And I happened to be chair of that position about the time that the legislation to allow the ICS was being debated in Canberra. So I spent time in writing submissions to parliamentary committees, appearing before Senate hearings, which was quite fun. There's a whole bunch of senators up there, and you realise they know less than you, so you get a bit more confident. And then,
so you were at the precipice of moving from Compile to ICS.
Yes, it's all my fault. It's out now. I can't hide it.
You joined at that pivotal time just before that, really, did you?
Yeah, well, a little bit before that. And as it turned out, I acted for a lot of people who were disadvantaged by it. I did some media telling them they shouldn't do it, and they still did it. So we set them up for a negligence or breach of duty. So, but yeah, other things, Law Council, Customs Committee and International Transactions. I set up the international law section at the Law Institute of Victoria, which is still going, thankfully. And I've been involved in a lot of the American Bar Association. I've got a role with them in their Customs and International Transactions group. Same thing in the UK, and a number of other aligned associations, you might think. So lawyers, I'm a chair of a committee on global trade and trade facilitation to the International Chamber of Commerce and to the OECD as well.
Yeah, you do a few advisory positions, don't you?
Yeah, so but I found that's the only way for me as a lawyer, that's the only way you can do it properly, because you can't do it, you have to do it properly. You can't sort of say, oh, I'm only doing the law bit, because by the time it gets to the black letter law and it's finished, all the opportunity to influence the agenda and deal with things and understand explanatory memoranda or regulatory impact statements, your opportunities are gone. So those are the things that inform you about what's going on. You get to meet kindred spirits in the associations.
Yes.
So it was the CBFCA then, so I met people like Steve Moore and Bob Wallace and those sort of people. And then over time, I developed a closer relationship with them. Over time, I, basically did more education. And now, of course, we have continuing professional development education. I do a lot of the legal stuff associated with that. But also, dealing with associations in New Zealand, associations in the UK and the US, not just lawyers, but customs brokers as well. So I think you can best serve your client by having a global view, certainly in what we're dealing with. You've got to have a global view because so much happens outside of Australia. So on the one hand, you've got China and the rest of Asia having a massive influence. I spent a lot of time in Korea, and China and Korea, although both times I went to Korea, I got really unwell. So I'm thinking about that one very carefully. But Korea, a lot of time in Vietnam, teaching them about WTO dumping legislation because they were about to join the WTO. Other parts of Asia, and then a lot of time spent in Europe with, and I did a lot of work with the Australian government through Austrade. We developed relationships. So I got the Law Council dealing with the Austrade people. So the idea is, you get as broad a view as you can, and you go to America and you realise that things, yes, they speak English, but they live a very different life in many respects.
Yes.
And I, I think they're wonderful people. But when you first arrive, almost the first thing we tell them is leave your sense of humour at the door and just go carefully.
Yeah, we have a different sense of humour, I guess, don't we?
Well, we do. It's sort of a crossover, but but knowing all those, having an idea of the economics and the politics of the thing. So, for example,
very important. Yeah.
Well, you haven't. It affects our trade directly. Problems in China multiply for us. We've just the Chinese premier here is at the moment, and they've Australia's just become the chair of the International Wine Group, and we're now selling our grains to China again, which means it's going to cost more here, which is
Yep. What about the wine?
Yeah, not great about that. But then other things, bauxite and the others. So and the trade there goes up and down as the politics does. So we had a falling out. So you realise that trade isn't purely about that. And it's like anti-dumping and trade remedies law. You realise that a lot of it is actually national protectionism dressed up so it complies with the WTO. And that's one of the other things, of course, is with a lot of the international law agreements, so the anti-dumping agreement, the countervailing agreement, the WCO harmonised system, or the WTO valuation agreement, they're all agreed at an international level. They all do them differently in different countries.
Yes, so, and this is, I'm so glad you raised this because it's that, and it's conventions or agreements like the Paris Agreement that we become signatories to, which the G20 countries are predominantly the ones,
Yeah, they're driving the agenda.
Driving the agenda, absolutely. But absolutely, they what happens, explain that process. They become, because we really need people to understand, it's not one piece of legislation for the whole world.
Well, it's interesting. When I speak to young lawyers who say, I want to be an international trade lawyer, the first thing I have to break to them is they're not going to go to Geneva the following day. If they want to go to Geneva and talk WTO, they should be a diplomat. And as it turns out, I do a lot of work with DFAT, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade anywhere, technical work on free trade agreements and how they operate. But what I explain to them is that there are these overarching international agreements, but then each country has to go home and implement it itself.
Correct. So, and they all do it differently, as you said, right?
So Australia we have the dumping and countervailing as part of the Customs Act. We do it entirely differently to America. In America, with a dumping investigation or a countervailing, their first inquiry by one agency is there any material injury? And if they find, it's only if they find there's material injury do they even go to the issue of normal values and export prices and the levels of, and in America, they're all done by way of public hearing, like court cases, as opposed to us, which is a paper-based thing. We do it all under a particular system. The EU does it differently, for example. But it's also politically contentious. The US have put significant additional dumping or protective measures on Chinese electric vehicles, and the EU's just done the same thing last week,
Yes,
25%.
yeah, I saw that on electric vehicles.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and hopefully it means really cheap ones for us.
Seems.
I will take the risk and drive a Tesla if it's cheap enough. So,
Oh.
um, but there are, and so yeah, so each country does it differently. So the UK, for example, recently well, sorry, the British left the EU, so that's
Yes.
Brexit. They sort of had a falling out, and I wasn't that surprised about Brexit because having spent 4 years growing up, or 3 years growing up in England in the 70s, I got the idea that a lot of the English didn't have a very high view about, didn't have a very terrific view about the Europeans anyway. They always thought of themselves as entirely separate.
Oh,
So
okay.
I wasn't surprised that Brexit tapped into that. But the Brits have had to actually implement a whole range of new legislation because they previously
They
relied
did.
upon EU stuff.
They did.
So,
They did.
and I remember being involved in Vietnam when they did the WTO. When they joined the WTO, they had to actually, part of the job was they had to accede to a WTO anti-dumping and countervailing. And basically what they did, they just copied it out in China, in Vietnamese, and said at the end of the day, it's the minister who makes the decision. So it was about a 2-page document at the end of the day.
Oh,
So
wow. Yeah,
it's so each country does it differently. So what happens,
that's
and
right.
even with, for example, the Americans have public rulings, and the American rulings on goods, whether they're on their value or their classification, might come out entirely differently in Australia. And
Yes.
Australia might end up with a
In other
different,
words, a different harmonised code. Yeah.
or a different approach to valuation. I did some work for
Yes.
a Japanese multinational selling sport shoes, and they had different outcomes in Australia for their things like royalties and license payments and R&D payments. They had different outcomes in Australia to New Zealand because our legislation was different, even though we both came from the same international starting point.
Yes.
So you get similar goods might be classified differently in different countries because they have a different harmonized system or they have a different interpretation. I mean, we had the issue here that, in Australia, the sort of the issues regarding gummies and so forth, that whether they were health things or whether they were actually more like confectionery.
Yes.
Um,
Whether a
that
medicament or a, yeah, that's right,
they can
confectionery.
end up
That's right.
being a medicament, but in doing that, the customs service or border force went to the High Court and said you should actually use the French version of the harmonised system, not the English
Yeah.
version.
Yeah.
The
And they
French
got it.
version, and in the end, luckily, the High Court were multilingual and were able to point out that the results would be the same regardless.
Yes. Yes. But interesting, isn't it? Yeah.
It was a bit scary, and we're all a bit excited when the decision came down, and the government then changed the legislation. So different outcomes in different countries, even for identical goods.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Both in harmonised coding, dumping, even with respect to the type of permits that it may be required, maybe for a CITES
Yeah.
convention or, you know,
And look, if I can share a story on CITES, which is the Convention
yeah,
on International Trade and Endangered Stuff.
species,
Usually
animals,
animals,
and yeah,
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 animals, but things like rosewood out of
yeah,
India and the like. And we had a
yeah.
client who very recently, who in fact, very nice chap, had spent a lot of money to go to Canada because he wanted to shoot a puma. Now, pumas in Canada are a pest.
I
So,
didn't even know they had them. Oh, they
they
do.
got them. They're everywhere.
Okay.
They pop out in supermarkets and everywhere.
Wow.
But pumas, so they're a pest. So he actually he shot one. It was sent to the taxidermist. So it's a stuffed dead puma. It's
Hmm.
on a beautiful mahogany mount, very attractive.
Right.
Something anybody would have in their
Was
home.
it right? Oh, in the. I was gonna. Wow. Yeah.
And he
Anyway.
got
Yeah.
a CITES export permit from the Canadians. The Canadians said, yes, this is a pest. We're happy we're complying with our international obligations.
Yeah.
You can export the good. Unfortunately, he didn't get a CITES import permit into Australia.
Right.
So we had a dispute. I had a dispute with the
So the
relevant
so the
department.
so the puma was held by customs in customs
Yes,
control for a
customs
little
seized
while.
it and said you don't have a CITES permit. I did point out that the puma was in fact dead, and it had been valiantly executed in the first place. It had been valiantly, and there was no issues with biosecurity, or there were no issues with any of those things. And therefore, what was the harm caused by allowing it to come into the country and giving it a permit now? And they refused. And in the end...
So it must have been on the Australian list of prohibited goods, which is different to the Canada.
Correct. Because, and look, I don't know anybody who's trying to walk through customs in Melbourne with a puma on a lead. That's going to be really alive or dead. I mean, and we have, and I did share one other story about one of the more unusual ones we've dealt with recently is that we've recently been negotiating with the government of Egypt because the Australian authorities, at the request of the Egyptian government, seized a mummy and a mummy mask from an Australian display in the Gold Coast. Right. So there is a display of a particular type in Gold Coast. So they had a beautiful mummy and a mummy mask. Now, the Egyptian authorities said to the Australian authorities, we believe these have been illegally exported from Egypt in about 1880, 1890. Right. That they didn't comply with the...
This stuff was sitting in a museum, I gather, somewhere?
Sitting in a museum come entertainment venue.
Right, got it.
Wow. And so they turned up and they seized them. And we were retained by the operator of the venue to say, can we get them back? And in the end, we had no way of verifying that in 1890, the American person in question had got a permit or not to send the goods, first of all, to America, and they then came to Australia. So we had very extended diplomatic engagement with the Egyptian consulate. Yeah, in the end,
they want it back.
We happily gave them back. We didn't want any sort of bad spirit to be in place. We did, if you're dealing with mummies and that sort of stuff, it's always a bit scary.
Oh yeah, there might be some bad energy there. Yeah.
Bad juju. So we actually, but they're the sort of things that don't come to mind first of all when you talk about the stuff we do. Yeah. But we have things with gel blasters, or we're having big issues now with tobacco and vapes. But recently, a client came to us and said, "We're setting up a charity, and the charity is going to sell tobacco. Can we get duty-free tobacco?"
Oh,
and we
goodness!
Said, maybe not.
No,
perhaps not. And
good try.
But recently the issues have changed, more global ones. So we had a lot of issues come out of COVID about controls on exports and imports. We then have, in particular with the Russia situation with the Ukraine, international export controls and sanctions.
Yeah, I was going to say, we'll talk about dual use after this because, a lot of people are not understanding what that is, and it's a trap.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's quite complex. And when you talk about export control goods, people think things like guns and weapons, and often a lot of those things are procured through government divisions which have strict controls on them. But dual-use goods, tell us about those.
Oh, well, dual-use goods are goods which they're on a dual goods register, goods which can be put for more than one purpose. One of those purposes is military or defence oriented. Now, I've run a couple of cases, one of which was about an Australian company which made walkie-talkies and sold them to Fiji. Now, unfortunately, they didn't realise that the walkie-talkie carried an encryption device in it so that people couldn't listen in. And they had exported them all without appropriate authorities being in place from Department of Export Controls. So we were discussing with the client about what the issue was, and the clients in the US were saying, "Oh, don't worry about it. They'll never find out." And I said, "That's fine, because when they do find out, and they will, because it went to government people in Fiji, you, the people on this call, you're the ones who are going to jail." And
yes, because it's criminal offences, right? It's pretty serious.
And they changed their position, and they allowed us to voluntarily disclose the problem, which we did. And over a period of time, it was negotiated out. We could trace where the items were, and we could tell them they were in legitimate hands and there was no misuse. Yes. We had a similar experience with a client who had a particular type of high-powered lighting system, which you could carry by hand for use in convention centres and displays. And they had one of their staff take it, hand carry it from Australia, from the office in Australia to China, to Shanghai. And they didn't realise, whoops, they needed a permit for it. So we had to do the same thing. And as is often the case, it's inadvertent, it's a breach. If you go voluntarily, you go to them first, you can usually negotiate a better outcome, which is better than waiting for them to kick your door in. So we
Yeah,
picked
yeah.
that. So yeah, they're the sort of dual use items, and even things like drones. Now we hear a lot about
Yes, yeah.
drones are a controlled export because they have a military purpose.
Mm-hmm.
There's an Australian exporter out of the northern part of Australia, shall we say,
Yeah.
who's been pinned twice in a row for selling Australian drones overseas without export permits.
Yep. Yep.
Now, depending on where they sent them to, it might also now be in breach of export sanctions.
Yes,
And it might be
yeah.
a problem with, depending if they're selling them to Russia, they're certainly in trouble.
Yeah.
Or they end up in there. So
And you just mentioned autonomous sanctions. Well, that
yeah,
captures people,
covers a
companies,
lot of
it covers anyone providing a service, which is a
yeah,
freight
it does
forwarder.
indeed. It does indeed. And we talked about agreements. We talked about AUKUS, which is the defence agreements, which allows for a license to exchange goods, but also to exchange defence services or defence strategic goods services, it's called.
Yeah.
Now, in the case with dual use goods and whatever, services are covered as well.
Mm-hmm.
So providing information, so it might be a textbook, or it might be a
Yeah.
diagram, or a book of diagrams, or even something as down to the level as a piece of explanatory document about how these things work could
Yeah.
be reverse engineered and therefore could be subject to the regime. So
Yeah. Yeah.
you have to
And
be very, very careful. Not only you know what you're dealing with and what the controls are, but also one of the key things is knowing where things are going. So
absolutely. Ultimate destination. Yeah.
you could be sending it to somewhere which seems normal and okay, but if there's a knowledge that those goods then get sent to Iraq or somewhere else,
Yeah.
that's a problem. Then you can be dragged into that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
That's right.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
sort of third party type arrangements.
Yeah, but as you said, it's goods that can be used or are deemed to be just harmless or for
Yeah.
everyday purpose.
Well,
But
we also had an issue with, of all things, sending chilled Australian lamb to the Middle East. And the concern which the client had it is that, was this lamb going to end up in the rations of the military people? So was it going to end up in Iranian military equipment? Was it going
yeah,
to be given to them?
yeah,
And in the end, we were able to say, well, this lamb or this food is actually going into somewhere else. It's
yeah,
going into retail. It wasn't going into a
yeah.
military. So we
Well,
weren't giving them help.
yeah, yeah. Well, and a lot of that stuff could be captured on autonomous sanctions,
Yeah.
luxury goods lists.
Well,
So
and
yeah,
you and I
yeah,
we've had a big week. And just
yeah.
look, it might be worthwhile to explain. There are UN sanctions, and we
Yes, there are.
implement those.
We do.
But for example, with the Ukraine, people wouldn't vote against. There weren't enough people to vote against Russia. So Australia has the right to impose its own sanctions, which
Yeah,
are therefore autonomous.
yeah,
And we designate individuals you can't deal with. We designate goods you can't export or goods you can't import. Now, oddly enough, you can't sell military equipment to Russia. Who'd have thought that? With the autonomous sanctions, or import them from there.
yes,
You can't sell them bauxite. You can't sell them. But even when it comes down to luxury goods, what we would call
yeah,
luxury goods,
yeah,
they're prohibited. New Zealand is slightly different, and the US is different. In the US, they even banned the import of caviar and vodka
yeah,
from
yeah.
Russia.
I've seen it on the list. Some of the lists. Yeah,
Yeah, which is a bit terrifying when you think about it.
yeah,
But
yeah,
how much it
yeah,
drills into your life. So that's all. And then we have thematic sanctions, and they aren't particular to people. They are particular to behaviour. So
mm-hmm.
if
Yeah,
a particular parties have been involved in cybersecurity breaches, or they've been involved in people smuggling or modern slavery, the theme is enough to invoke a penalty or a restriction on them. So we have
yeah,
and I was told in Washington a couple of years ago, I was talking export controls to the people in Washington, one of the really big firms that does a lot of work in trade, and I deal with them quite regularly. They were all sitting there with their heads in their hands saying Australia has the most stringent controls
yes.
on, to do with sanctions, much more than perhaps even they did. And so they were always interested to know. So they would give the sign off in in the US. They'd have people sign off in the EU and the UK, and then they come to us to get to sign off, or otherwise out of Australia and New Zealand.
Yeah, interesting, isn't it? Yeah,
Yeah.
fascinating. But you've done a great job of explaining the complexities and how our focus globally is much more global than it
Yeah.
ever was, and we are part of the global economy, trade, and politics.
Very much.
And what complexities that creates across borders, and particularly for dealing with these things and governments with respect
Yeah.
to how you report them, what permits you require. Really, really complex. Thanks
Yeah.
for doing that.
That's right.
What are the industrial relationships with governments and industry at the moment like? How are we tracking? Because we go hot and cold.
We do, and it goes in cycles, and it often
Yeah.
depends upon the agency. So, for
Right.
example, we have a very close and cheerful and loving relationship with DFAT, because they come to us and talk about free trade agreements and how they're implemented and what we need to put in them. And we want them to have free trade agreements, so we get concessions on entry and so forth. Other agencies who are more of immediate engagement. So we're talking probably the big ones, people like Border Force and Department of Agriculture. At different times, those relationships rotate a bit. Sometimes everyone's on the same page and gets on tremendously well. At other times, because of government policy, concerns about trusted insiders in the supply chain, concerns
Yeah.
about uh, particular types of prawns being infected, that relationship changes, and it becomes a bit much more formal and structured, and the policy dictates changes in the approach. So what might happen on one day may be entirely different 6 months later, depending on what's happened. And this is, I think, a little bit of what's happening at the moment in the supply chain with tobacco and vapes, more so than and drugs, of course, has always been a perennial issue. But there's now issues with piggybacking, people people pretending to be legitimate traders,
Yes.
but bringing in large amounts of tobacco without getting permits or paying the duty, or bringing in vapes where they shouldn't be doing it.
Yeah.
That, and people in Melbourne are, there are shops being firebombed, there are people being threatened, there's a whole underworld behind it all. So often the logistics part of the chain, or the service providers, get caught in the middle of it, because they're the ones who get caught up directly or indirectly or inadvertently moving those goods across the border. So you end up in a slightly more contentious and a slightly more, although at the same time, government we often remind government that on many occasions the people who identify what's a smuggling exercise or a piggybacking exercise are the service providers, the freight forwarder who realises that
Something doesn't add up on these documents.
correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, or they're moving hundreds of tons of stuff, and it's all they've got is a Gmail address. Or you do an email, or you do a search of the property, and you find out it's a residential property it's going to. Or you do searches of the premises where it's coming from in Malaysia, which is what I've done in some dumping cases, and we found out the so-called manufacturing facility of the goods out of Malaysia is in fact a burnt out 7-Eleven. So they're not really Malaysian goods. So that's when so there is an interdependence, a reliance one upon the other. There isn't a total evenness. People don't, there isn't, government has secret stuff and we have commercial relationships. Yeah. Sometimes people are involved and they're told to go hard on certain things. And they're told to go, be that much more prepared to use powers they have. At the end of the day, the Customs Act from 1901, which I still say needs rewriting. I keep telling people, but
you've been saying this for a long time. Yeah,
I've been saying right, but it has massive powers. Customs, Border Force has extraordinary breadth and depth of powers as to what they can and can't do. And they don't often get used, but on occasions they do get used, and it's then a case of, well, I didn't realise these people were very good liars, all the above. So sometimes the relationship becomes more tenuous between the agency and the private
industry.
sector. Yeah. But I can say from as a member of the private sector, and from the perspective of in all my directorships, we do work really hard at engagement, at a helpful and a useful engagement with government.
Yeah.
And government does what it can in terms of facilitating that relationship. And,
Yeah, which is a great thing. So I think it's very important. Yeah.
and also for me, I mean, that's where I came from. Dad was a high-powered customs officer, public servant with a very strong idea about right and wrong and what was and who was dodgy and he was in customs for 34 years before he went into consultancy at KPMG. So I had a very firm view told to me every night, basically, about the sort of dodgy things which were happening, or the unfortunate things, or the things to look out for. So I come from that background, so it's easier for me to understand what their role is and how important it is.
Yeah, that's a great advantage to have, because people don't realise customs are not there just to collect duties. Actually, their primary focus is to protect the community.
Correct, and that's it. I mean, for a long time it was duty because we had large amounts of duty. Now duties are pretty low in many respects. We're getting rid of nuisance tariffs. Anti-dumping and countervailing duties are quite high, but that's for a particular reason, to sort of even out behaviours. But they have a community protection obligation. They will seize goods where you think they're seizing goods because they're infringing someone's intellectual property. But because they're illegitimate goods, they can be dangerous. So there were cases a number of years ago where they seized dishwashing powder or clothes washing powder, which was found to be actually poisonous effectively. So they took that off the marketplace, and they were able to do that because of their intellectual property rights.
Yeah. Like it might have had a component, it might have had some asbestos or something in it, right?
Yeah.
Totally prohibited.
It actually had acid, I think. It actually had acid, so that was possibly a bad thing.
Yeah, not a great thing. Yeah,
not a great thing. Not acceptable.
You mentioned DFAT, and we've recently got the AUKUS focus.
Yes.
And cooperation and partnership. Want to tell us a little bit about that, because it sort of goes back to the defence and controlled goods.
Absolutely. Now, so we think about it as America has a very tough regime when it comes to exporting items that are of national defence or security interest, as does the UK and as does Australia. So we've entered into this partnership agreement called AUKUS, Australia, UK, US, part of which is on the exchange of information. Part of it relates to exchange of equipment and services and the like. And obviously the first thing we think about is submarines, whereby they've kindly agreed to sell us some nuclear submarines, which is mildly exciting. But there's other exchanges. I mean, we're interacting with the development of drones, with the development of other technologies and so forth. So if you have to get a permit every time, it's going to be a pain. So the whole idea is they set up under AUKUS. It's effectively it's a club, it's a group. 3 countries would have said, okay, we will have a license-free environment. So if you sell goods which come with it, if you're moving goods or services within a particular definition, you're an approved person and you're dealing with approved goods, you don't need to get a license every time. It just travels back and forward and travel back and forward. Now, the Americans have largely signed off on their legislation. We've passed an act to allow it to happen, but we're now developing the regulations to allow it to happen. The English are doing the same thing. The United Kingdom is doing the same thing, as is the US. So this is a rare occasion. Well, it's one of the occasions where 3 countries working in a defence base have realised that the importance of the defence relationship is such as they have to try and facilitate this. And it's a classic trade facilitation, the national interest in exchanging it without permits and being able to move these goods easily and move these ideas and these services would support a license-free environment.
Yeah, and support the trade between those 3 countries.
Absolutely, when it comes to these things.
Yeah. So going back to DFAT again,
the
AUKUS focus, I mean, Australia has a free trade agreement with the US, the UK.
Very old one.
We have a lot of other free trade agreements. They're more than just about trade these days, though.
They are, and look, that is one of the things we've learned and realised over very recent time. The trade agreements don't necessarily mean free trade. They might mean slightly freer trade, but
Yes.
it's all driven by national interest. Australia for a long time has been relatively altruistic and said we want to facilitate trade because it's good for Australia, but now increasingly trade sort of almost comes equal to or second to things like national interest. And you can see that in America with the Inflation Reduction Act and the Semiconductor Act, where they are basically trying to re-establish American sovereign industries and manufacturing, which they got rid of because they're concerned that they don't want to have to buy it from anyone else overseas. So they put measures into place to protect what they say, protect American jobs, protect American interests and the like. So that's where that comes from. Trade agreements now, we've got chapters on illegal fishing.
Yeah.
Modern slavery is a big one. The Americans have a much more advanced system dealing with the modern slavery and goods to the product of forced labour, especially from the Uyghur parts of China, where they can take them off the ship and say, we believe these are the product of modern labour, prove us wrong. Now, we don't have those rights yet. So that's something we're going to look at. But things like diversity and gender, labour standards, environmental issues, these are all things now that are written into free trade agreements. So we're seeing the whole ESG agenda, environmental and social governance, now being played out. And an interesting thing is in America, usually the lead party on a lot of trade issues is the US Trade Representative. Now we're talking more to the Department of Commerce, the Secretary of Commerce, who's more about their industry. So it just shows the way things switch around. And even in Australia, we're the same. We've put billions aside to help us develop modern Australian industry, and so that we actually don't just dig things out of the ground. We process them.
We actually manufacture them. Yeah.
Correct.
Well, we did a similar thing to the US, though. We moved a lot of our industry offshore. So you can see the shift. The shift.
Absolutely. And now it's coming back the other way. So the US has got a deal with, the US had a trade deal with Mexico. They're now, they then wanted to pull that back. And basically the Trump government basically rewrote it in a way that suited the Americans. They were worried about cars and jobs and so forth. I saw today that Chile, which is trying to get into the regional cooperation economic partnership, which is really between ASEAN countries. The British have joined the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, even though they don't have any, none of their shores are anywhere near the Pacific. It's like, but so national interest does dictate it, and we are seeing. So we have to be across things. It's not just green energy for aircraft or for ships or container ships with big sails. There's a lot more of those, the interests, and also they're looking more at the interests of small to medium enterprises, because they often struggle to get into the larger economy. So we have to try and facilitate that. How do we make their trade easier? How do we facilitate their interests?
Yeah, that's very important, isn't it?
Yeah.
And so we have, these shifting, I guess, focuses from governments, which are influenced from global treaties, agreements. And so we see these changes. Do you think we'll go back to high duty rates again to protect our industries?
Well, look, the lawyer in me says, of course they should. But the reality is we tried that. We tried that during the Depression. There was a Smoot-Hawley Act in the US, which basically ramped up, and Australia ramped up its tariff rates because we wanted to protect Australia and we wanted to keep all the foreign stuff out, and it was a disaster. It was, it's a recognised economic disaster. I think we will still see high duty rates for dumping and countervailing, because that is seen as trying to remedy unfair practices by the other countries. And Australia's getting rid of our nuisance tariffs at 497 lines.
Quite a few.
Toothbrushes and toothpaste and a whole bunch of stuff that you didn't read, and including foodstuffs as well, by the way. So I think there is still, but they'll be used strategically. And this is what the US does unashamedly. Their levels of duties they imposed under the Trump administration, they imposed significant additional duties because it was in the national interest or it was in a defence interest. So they put duties
You're
on.
referring to the duties on China, yeah.
232 and 301, and we were exempted from those for aluminium. But then recently but interestingly, the Biden administration didn't get rid of those. And in fact, they've ramped them up even further. So it's almost a race to see who can be more popular by looking after American interests. So from that perspective, I don't think Australia will do that. We've whacked 35% tariff on Russian and Belarusian goods, which is neither here nor there in many respects. But we might do it in times of crisis, for example. But I don't think
electronic or commodity, although we've got dumping as a way of also imposing.
We do, and there's and dumping is the classic case where you've got economics, law, and politics, because ultimately decisions on many things and dumping regimes, decisions come down to the minister acting on advice of the Anti-Dumping Commission. So we have a political element to it, which other countries don't have. They leave it to the departments. So people say, the minister. So generally the idea is the minister acts on advice. So they get the Anti-Dumping Commission, gives them advice, and they take the advice and they act accordingly. Not always, but on occasions. But generally speaking, they will follow advice. But I think they might be used with there's a strategic concern, or if we've got more international conflicts, for example.
They're important, aren't they, to keeping the peace where we can? Yeah,
and also, I mean, during COVID, they put a lot more restrictions on trade of certain items and so forth. So they're your classic force majeure situations, whether it's like a COVID type thing, or whether it's weather, or whether it's there's a whole range of warfare, for example. And we're still seeing in the Red Sea at the moment people unable to use the Suez Canal and not wanting to, because they're worried that their ships are going to get boarded, and there've been of recent time ships trashed and sunk, and that adds time and therefore cost and therefore inconvenience to the whole market.
It does, indeed, it does. We it's quite a complex and really interesting industry, isn't it? Aren't you glad you chose it?
Well, I am. I lucked into it. There were a few people. At some point, I made the choice to specialise in it. I was already a partner, and I could have gone on implementing tax effective structuring agreements or doing acquisitions and commercial deals, and it wouldn't have filled the soul. And I think that's why I say to young lawyers when they come through and they say, what law should I do? And I said, well, what are you interested in? And they say, well, if you're not interested in it and you're not prepared to make an effort, it's really no point at the end of the day.
Don't do it.
And because a lot of what I do isn't taught at university. You've actually got to go and do it yourself. You've got to do your own research. You've got to understand politics. You've got to do a bit on this and a bit on that. But you've got to educate yourself. And a lot of young lawyers can be a bit put off by that, because they say, well, I've never, briefly, one story. We have, our Customs Act, how big it is. When you go online, it's actually there in a number of different volumes online. So there's volume 1 goes to section 183, and there's others. Anyway, I asked this young man to look up a section of the Customs Act, and he said it doesn't exist. And I said, I think it does. I'm pretty sure it does. Look again. He said, no, it doesn't exist. Now, what he hadn't realised was the Customs Act online was divided into 4 volumes, and he hadn't gone beyond the first volume. And I sat there and I said, you're not going to make it. This is not your thing. You're going to have to be able to do some research. And often people have to do research in anti-dumping. Often we follow investigations. They start in Canada, they go to the US, they end up with us, and they go to Indonesia and India on the same goods. So you're going to have to read more widely and educate yourself. So a lot of it's self-education. But if you're interested, you'll do it. If you're not, not interested, you won't do it, and you won't be particularly good at it.
Yeah. And what is the interest rate like? Because I know for the service providers and generally across the logistics industry, which, by the way, I think employs 1 in 5 people globally.
Yeah, it does.
A lot of people fall into the industry that don't actually realise that these amazing career opportunities,
which is infuriating. It's a little bit different in Europe, I think. In Europe, they're very
proud.
They do university courses in logistics.
Yep. Yep.
Whereas with us, it's sort of cobbled together a little bit. And, if you were to leave the industry, one thing you want for the industry is for it to be acknowledged for its importance and recognised for its importance. Politicians say, "Oh, you're the linchpin of the economy. You make it work." They don't understand often what they're saying. They're just reading someone's speech. But
Yes.
it is vital what is done at the border, moving the goods in and out of the country. Without it, I think Australia's only got, at any given stage, the suggestion we've only got 7 days worth of canned and processed foodstuffs available. So, or oil. I mean, one of the big things with us is if the China Sea blows up and we can't get our tankers through, we don't have oil for very long. We run out of it.
Yeah.
So so you're right. The industry is vital. The ability to move the goods and to do it legally and properly and legitimately is really vital. And the fact that it's not seen at a secondary school level or seen at an undergraduate level or seen at a graduate, it's not. So I think there's a lot of work to be done on making it more obvious to people about what it's in, and that's also to try and redress the gender balance at this point, as you'd be aware, Christine, I'm sure.
Yeah. Coming from industry, it's very much
Well, it's for a long time
male
it's been
dominated, but
said,
we're seeing a lot more,
we are.
interest but it's really, there's some amazing career opportunities, and I think that's what people need to be aware of. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And a bit like you, as a young guy who said, I want to be a lawyer, we want them thinking from a young age, logistics, that's
and to be involved in, and I think that's why we're seeing young lawyers coming through saying, I want to do international trade, and they think it's all the WTO in Brussels. Well, it's not. And it's actually interesting. My stepson, who's 19, his preferred career now is to get a cadetship effectively in the border force, to do cadetship 12 months with the border force, maybe 2 years with the border force.
Fantastic.
Well, I'm horrified, but there you go. I mean, that's just the way.
I think it's a great introduction to the industry.
I think it is too. But yes, the more we can get out there, the more options we have, the better educated they become, and the more sophisticated the industry. Because the industry is incredibly difficult to run. If you put anybody, even a tech expert, in front of an ICS screen, they've got no idea. It's so much can go wrong.
Yeah.
There's so many different concepts going on at the same time, and people keep them in their heads, and they're able to do it. And the fact that there's not more disasters occasionally surprises me.
It's actually very interesting, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah, it is. What about what are the qualifications here in Australia that we do respect and revere fairly highly? Is the customs broker's qualification?
Yes.
And the little bit that I know is, that's something not that revered in most nations across the world, although in some countries like Spain, I think Brazil, you actually have to be a lawyer to...
Yeah, and I know I wouldn't want to be a customs broker. It involves a lot of stuff with figures and stuff like that, and I'm not great with figures. But it's right. And this is part of the quandary is logistics, and the border clearance industry is dealt with very differently in different countries.
Very differently, yeah.
The WTO recognises the importance of freight forwarders and customs brokers, but doesn't say they have to be licensed. Australia, it does. Australia, we have a licensed industry for customs brokers.
Yeah.
In New Zealand, we used to have it, but we no longer have. They don't have a licensed industry, customs brokers, licensed customs brokers. They have an alternative regime in which they don't have to be licensed, but if they're not making their entries properly, or they're doing it incorrectly, or we don't like them, we can cut off their access to the system. So that's how they deal with it for people who aren't up to scratch, which is another alternative. Yeah. And for many years, there was a conspiracy theory that customers wanted to get rid of customs brokers. Well, it wouldn't happen now because of the focus on border security and supply chains. Why would you open up to unlicensed people? And the other thing is that, of course, freight forwarders aren't licensed as they are elsewhere in the world. So the United States has a licensed arrangement or licensed system. The Philippines does, but the UK doesn't. But I think it's heading back towards that.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
but the role of the customs broker, it's recognised, and one of the things that the WTO says, it recognises the importance of the customs broker as a force multiplier. So you tell one customs broker about a change, they tell 20 clients.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we're doing their job. We're educating them. But
Absolutely.
there is it is treated very differently, and that's why in Europe there's significant interest because of the fact that there's university courses, and also in Europe it's a bit different. They're all what we call contiguous. They're all countries together.
Yes, they
So
are.
there's rail and road, air and sea. Now, as far as I know, people trying to run railways from Asia to Australia don't get very far because we keep losing them. And the drivers, they keep drowning because the vehicles just nowhere. So we've got a differently constituted industry,
Yeah.
whereas it's a little bit. When you speak to the European practitioners, they're all about. They're thinking about rail freight across borders,
Yeah.
and they're thinking about trucks across borders.
Yeah. The
And
land
that was one of the
borders.
concerns.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's one of the concerns they had about with Brexit was that there'd be all of a sudden you had to have proper customs clearance going into the UK,
Yeah.
which meant that you'd have thousands of trucks backed up while they drag their passports out and their approvals to move the goods through the channel. So it is done differently, but I think the WTO has the role clearly in that. The World Customs Organization has a role when it comes to that, and a number of other, and a lot of the different authorities in different regions have a role. So the Asian Development Bank has a role in facilitating trade, and everybody is interested in reducing the cost, but also facilitating it and making sure it goes through properly.
Yeah.
So they don't do that properly, and they don't want impediments. That's why we have a WTO trade facilitation agreement, which is a lot of nice things about how we want to facilitate trade, how we want to make things available online. We want to make things easier for SMEs. Whereas the reality in a lot of developing countries, especially through Africa, is that one of the highest government revenues comes from customs duties. So they have high rates of duty.
Still fairly high, yeah.
They're really high, and that inhibits people from trading in and out of those countries. And they don't have a transparent border. Ours is pretty transparent. Well, it is to you and I because we've done a lot of work in it.
Yeah.
But a lot of people coming into the industry, SMEs, or even they call them MSMEs now, micro, small, medium enterprises, the very small operators. They look at the border, and the simplified trade system people did a record of this. They said there's about 30 government agencies at the border, and over 2,000 pieces of legislation. So how is your small business person or your startups, how are they going to deal with that? And that's where the importance of customs brokers, freight forwarders, consultants, such as you've been and still are. That's why they're so important, because people can't trade properly and without risk unless it's all done properly, and therefore they've got to make them available. And I think that's where government should be doing perhaps a little bit more on that.
Yeah, and that's on top of a very complex, end-to-end supply chain with many, many touch points. So, yeah.
I mean, and the other difficult thing is, of course, there are so many acronyms.
Oh,
and
aren't we good at that?
We all talk about acronyms and, ANSFTA and CHAFTA and USFTA and all that sort of, and people just blank, and people just blank out. And now we've got AUKUS as a new one. So the industry lives off. And so to the person who doesn't live and breathe the industry, they sit there and half the time it's like, can you explain what this means? Oh, well, that's what it means. And then we get lost in Incoterms.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah, and the Europeans didn't do us any favours with Incoterms, and then they change them every 10 years.
Yeah, of course they do.
And people say, oh, if I just put the Incoterm in to a document, that's enough. No, you're still going to have a proper agreement about buying and selling and pricings and goods and what they are and what your dispute is. The Incoterm just governs the bit about moving the goods from point A to point B and how that's done and who
Yeah,
has whatever responsibilities. So the
absolutely.
Incoterms people still there, they make a big deal about their, and it's part of it, but it's not everything. You
No.
still have to put your Incoterm on your full import declaration. And if you get it wrong, you can be penalised, and that's the other
Yep.
part.
Yep.
You can be penalised for errors on declarations, even if it has no impact on revenue or it has no impact. You can still be penalised for it, which is one of the slightly
Absolutely.
ridiculous things. I
Yeah.
didn't. We objected to that at the time they introduced it, Section
An error
240.
is an error, so here's a fine. Yeah, I guess,
Yeah,
isn't it?
who's
Yeah.
perfect? Who's
Yeah.
perfect?
Which is, I guess, a good could be part of the revenue raising. Who knows? But
Yeah,
nevertheless, so yeah, we do need to attract more people into the industry.
we do.
We need them to see that there is some wonderful careers in this
Yeah,
very interesting industry.
I
Actually,
think industry associations are doing it. So at the recent IFCMA conference, and I've been involved in setting up, and it depends upon how much free time I have, but a
yeah.
young professionals network. And we actually gave a young professionals award for the first time. We
Oh,
had nominees,
fantastic.
and
Yeah.
and I was dragged out of the audience to give the award. Now, there's nothing worse than seeing a bright young person smiling with their award next to me as an old man with silver hair. A good look. I looked at it and I went, oh, absolutely. Anyway, but we're doing the same thing in New Zealand and other parts of the
Good.
world. Certainly, the British Institute of Forwarders, BIFA, they have a very active young forwarders or young professionals network
Fantastic. Yeah.
and
And
including mentoring, including support from your colleagues, including presents and gifts and all sorts of
yeah.
yummy things. So
Yeah.
the more we can do that and make it accessible to them, and I think mentoring is really important. So we speak about
Yes, I
young
agree.
brokers or young freight forwarders. If there are people they can go to outside of their own organisation, if
Yes.
there's someone else, it's like a mercy call. I'm
Yeah.
stuck. Can you help me? I've got in a
Yeah.
really hard position here. What would you say? And I
Yeah.
get a lot of that anyway. I get a lot of calls from brokers who say, I don't think this is right. What should we do? Or how do we handle it? And they don't talk to people internally because they're being told, just get it through, just get it through, just get it through.
Mm. Mm.
And they don't want to do that. They want to do it properly.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. So, look, you've been incredible to have on. Thank you very much for your time. We're
You,
going to do a bit of fun stuff now, if that's all right.
fun
We've
stuff would
got
be good.
what we call some quick fire questions, and we've also got a question from the last guest who didn't know who the next guest was going to be for you.
Okay.
So,
Go for it.
all right. So, looking back now, I mean, as you said, you've been in the industry for a long time, and you've got a lot of wisdom.
Yeah.
Looking at back at your 11-year-old, 15-year-old self,
Yeah.
if you could go back and give yourself some advice, what would it be?
Do what you like. Do what you're interested in. That's all. That's the best thing you can do. Don't go into something because it's trendy or because other people say it's good or because you think you'll make more money that way. Unless you're interested and unless you can take it on like a vacation, I'm not thinking about being a priest, but if you're enthusiastic about it and it captures your attention and captures your interest
Follow
and
your
allows
heart.
you
Yeah.
to then and heart as part of
Yeah.
it,
Yeah.
yeah, that's what I tell them.
Yeah. Follow your passion. Follow what you enjoy
Correct.
doing. Yeah. And it doesn't feel like a day of work then, does it?
Well, some days, but often when you sit back at 6 o'clock, you say, okay, that was. I mean, today I had 3 hours of different hearings in the AAT, and I was doing all the
Did
advocacy. And at the end
you?
of it, I sort of came off and said, "Man, I'm not a barrister, but I'm a bit tired." But so
Yeah.
those
Yeah.
things are good, and we've settled a big case we've been running. We've settled it,
Fantastic.
and those things are good. You get some
Yeah.
outcomes. Yeah.
You obviously have a very incredible schedule, given your generosity to
Mm.
as on a director role and in advisory positions on top of everything else you do. What do you do in your free time when you get some free time to enjoy?
Free time is something I don't probably have as much as I like. I love spending time with my wife. She's my bestie. She's my wing
Oh,
person,
yeah, I love
and
that.
and both of us say we just want to spend more time with one another. It doesn't really matter in the good and the bad. And also my kids fall into that category as well.
Oh, that's lovely.
I have three children. I have a stepson. I have two sons and a daughter who I'm terrified of because she's 21 and she wants to rule the world, and she will. And now I can't wait for her to take over. And she won't take rubbish from anybody. And I've seen her in action, so I know what that's like. Kids, family, and just being able to spend time with friends and switch off and talk about something else for a while.
Yeah, I get it. Yeah, sounds good. All right. Do you like to read?
I read
other than legal acts and regs, I say, Andrew.
I do. I love to read. I did, historical stuff in particular. I love autobiographies, so I've read probably a lot of the autobiographies about JFK. In fact, I have a JFK bobblehead in my room.
Right, very interesting. Yeah,
which my wife bought for me because she knows my level of interest. But
what are you reading at the moment?
At the moment, I'm rereading a book written by a journalist in London, but an Australian journalist in London, who recreated what used to be called the kangaroo route between England and Australia, and how went through a whole lot of shorter flights through a whole lot of different countries. And he basically traced it in modern times, retraced it, and what he went through.
Yeah, wow.
It's fascinating. Places have changed and countries have changed. You can and can't get into places. I'd love to redo it now because he wrote the book probably 20 years ago. I'd love to redo it now because journalism was for about 3 minutes a possible career, but it's just how to relive their experience of coming. They would fly from London to Paris, and they'd have lunch on the plane, and then they'd have a sleep, and then they go on the they fly somewhere else. They fly to Italy, and they get on some seaplanes. So there was a lot of seaplanes. I'm being a nerd, I know, but So those
sounds fascinating. Yeah. What about? Do you have a favourite holiday destination?
Well, it's a very good question. Until recently, my two favourites were London and New York, because I grew up in part in London, and New York is just middle of everything. But I did recently. My wife and I went to a wedding, which was held on Magnetic Island, off Townsville, and it was just brilliant. There's a couple of beautiful resorts there, and a lot of quite basic sort of places, pubs and so forth, and we had the best time. And you'd be sitting out there having a steak outside, and a kookaburra would come and sit on your shoulder and want to have your steak with you.
Oh, wow.
And just the history of the place. So we love Magnetic Island. It's a great place to decompress. So for once I have an Australian favourite. Oh, that and Cape Woolamai off in Phillip Island, which is the back beach.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Sounds lovely. All right. Well, we're going to ask you now the question from the last guest. Let me get that from the team here. If you weren't in the logistics industry, involved in customs and trade and freight-related matters, what would you be doing?
I'd be the chief cricket writer for the Fairfax newspaper group.
Not the gossip column?
And there is still part of me that says that if they came to me and said, we want you to be the chief cricket writer for a large newspaper group, would you be interested? I'd be out the door and in that job before you can say anything. We just, trade nerds are like cricket nerds. They just live and breathe it, and that's me. And I'd love someone to pay me to travel and watch and write about it. So that's what I would be doing. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Well, you never know. Andrew, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure having you here. Where can people find you and the company you work for, Rigby Cooke Lawyers?
Yes. Well, we're in the Melbourne Central building in Melbourne, but I'm often on the road, so wherever you need me, we can be there.
What about some of the social media? You're on LinkedIn.
Not a lot, really. Yeah, I'm not on. I'm not on any of the swipe right ones. No, I'm on LinkedIn. I publish quite regularly. I write articles for journals every month, so LinkedIn predominantly, but also there's a bit on X, which is formerly Twitter. But predominantly on LinkedIn, a lot of the stuff I publish goes on there, or stuff I see and I just share. I'm very happy to share things I think are interesting, and seemingly other people are interested as well. So LinkedIn would be the best probably place to find me.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, you heard that, everyone. You can find Andrew on LinkedIn, and also the Rigby Cooke Lawyers.
On our website, of course.
And of course now you're going to be on the Freight Directory podcast listing webpage, and you can find the Freight Directory podcast. You can follow us actually on all social media platforms: LinkedIn, YouTube, Instagram, Facebook. I'm being told TikTok. So do follow us, please, if you like this, and we can keep having amazing people like Andrew in.
Well, I'll be sharing that. Christine.
Excellent. And once again, thank you. Thank you very much to Andrew. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for listening to us. And we'll see you around. See you next time. Bye.